Thanks, Neil, and good evening to all of you. Not quite sure how Neil and Michael are going to weave this into a wealth management presentation, because when oil was $100 a barrel, that was the business we were in. At $40 a barrel, we're not in the wealth management business at the moment. But nonetheless, the energy business we are, and I've spent my entire life working in that sector. If none of you are interested in energy, it's going to be a boring evening, but I'm vitally interested in it. And to begin with a fairly controversial assertion, it will be simply this, that energy explains everything. Absolutely everything that's happening in the world. And that is because energy is more important than anything in the world, even more important than food, because without energy, without mechanisation, we could not produce food to feed 7.5 billion people. We'd all be living in the paddocks, eating what we could grow. So energy explains everything, and I hope over the next 20 minutes or so, I'll be able to put that into some context. Now, when I say energy explains everything, in this industry, there are three gods we serve, and I often give the speech and talk about those three gods. They're reliability, affordability, and sustainability. And they are in that order. If you do not have a reliable supply of energy, you don't care about its affordability. And if you don't have a reliable and affordable supply of energy, you don't care about its sustainability. And those drivers, that hierarchy, that natural hierarchy, drives an enormous amount of what happens in the world, in geopolitical terms, in economic terms, and in social terms as well. So just to give you some examples of that, if we take the question of reliability first, the World Health Organization estimates that 4.5 million people die a year from indoor air pollution. That's burning dung and biomass just to have a hot meal. It's the only access to energy they have. It's not even reliable. It's affordable because they gather it, but it's killing them. The World Health Organization estimates 2.5 million people a year die from outdoor air quality, particulate matter. You'll know that in China, this PM 2.5 is a magical number. That's the particle size 2.5 that comes from pollution from coal-fired power stations. In India and China, we have the most polluted cities in the world. 25 parts per million of PM 2.5 is considered safe by the World Health Organization. In Indian cities and Chinese cities, less so now, it's 500, sometimes 700 parts per million. So when you see these stories of smog, understand people are dying in their millions because of the air quality. Now, why? Because they place reliability and affordability as greater goods. Jobs, security of jobs, economic growth, economic development. In China, the most amazing story of 500 million people being lifted out of poverty through a growing economy, largely based off cheap energy in China, obviously coal, staggering amount of coal being burnt in China and low quality coal at that. You see this hierarchy at work all the time. In Japan, you'll know with the earthquake and tidal wave that followed, the so-called events of Fukushima, that resulted in the shutting down of 52, that is all of the nuclear reactors in Japan. 52 nuclear reactors shut down like that. None of them have been brought back into service. Japan pays whatever they have to pay to import LNG to maintain a reliable supply of energy in Japan. In Australia, where do you see that hierarchy? Well, firstly, we're a country that has a very reliable supply of energy. We all take it for granted. Probably swear and curse if we have a storm and perhaps a local power line comes down. Our power systems are 99.8% reliable, a very high level of reliability, and generally quite affordable. But we've had two events in Australia in very recent times that you may or may not have read about, that also show you how that hierarchy works. So, for example, in Tasmania, largely, I would say, through mismanagement of their water resource, they were short energy, the electrical connector failed. What happened? Just don't matter what it costs, just throw in as many gas turbines as you can so we can still generate electricity for people. Governments are thrown out if there is not a reliable supply of energy. So we see this hierarchy play out in Australia. It doesn't matter what it costs, just make it work. In South Australia, you may have read recently about the impact of high prices of energy on the South Australian economy directly, and I'll talk about it more later in the context or as a consequence of the introduction of high levels of renewable energy in South Australia. So sustainability, that is reducing environmental impact, was to be the greater good. The only problem is it's now clearly having an impact on affordability and reliability, and so that hierarchy is in place yet again. So when we talk about energy, and we think about energy whether it's locally or globally, think about that hierarchy and think about all the decisions being processed through those three filters. To give another example, in Western Europe, many would say Western Europe has led the world in terms of introducing renewable energy, wind farms all over Western Europe and in the UK. And that would be true because governments have found it relatively easy to convince communities to pay the extra price of renewable energy because of the intrinsic good that comes from that. The reality is it's largely a geopolitical response to Western European dependency upon Russian gas and the need to diverse their energy supplies. And it's come at an extraordinary cost to Western Europe, which I'll talk about shortly. So the first thing in setting up this discussion about energy explains everything is to talk about that hierarchy and understand how it affects from local to global decisions. The second is to talk briefly about technology and the impact that technology is having on energy supply. And my view is when the history of the first half of the 21st century is writ, people will marvel about human innovation, human ability to manipulate two very ordinary things. And those two very ordinary things is sand and shale. Why sand? Because sand is silicon. And silicon is at the core of all digital technologies which are so shaping our world today. And human ability to manipulate the silicon molecule and create all the wonders of Pokemon Go, which was talked about a minute ago, to all of the applications that you take for granted today, your mobile phone, the camera in your phone, that's just sand. So our ability, human ability to manipulate sand is extraordinary. And the show and tell I brought is this other thing here. And I'll pass it around for you. That's a piece of shale. Some of you will have heard about shale in the US and the extraordinary impact that shale has had. And I'll pass it around, but I want it back. This bit of shale has been somewhere near the surface of the earth for many millions of years. It's been in a road cutting for tens and tens of years. It's been sitting on my desk for about 3 years. But as you pass it around, if you sniff it or you perhaps try and scratch it, you'll be able to smell kerogen. Kerogen is what creates oil. Kerogen is the biological matter that creates oil. So I'll just pass that around and that's what shale is. So when people talk about the shale revolution and the huge impact it's had on global energy supplies, what they're talking about is people's ability to drill 3,000 metres down, hit something like this, about the thickness of this room, maybe 2 stories in a building, and then drill 3,000 metres directional, horizontal into that, crack it and make it flow like you wouldn't believe. So when I pass that around, how can that possibly flow oil? If there was ever blood from a stone, this is it. So I'll pass that around, you might want to have a look at it. That's the show and tell for today. But that's what shale is. And why is shale important? Because shale has profoundly changed the energy story, the world's energy story, and is influencing everything. As I said, energy explains everything. So how has it done so? Firstly, in the US, America has gone from being arguably the world's largest consumer of oil and potentially the world's largest importer of oil, and it was going to be the world's largest importer of LNG, to holding now, in a period of just 5 years, certainly no more than 10, more oil resources than anywhere else in the world. It is becoming an oil exporter, and more gas resources than anywhere else in the world, order of magnitude greater. And that ability to just drill down into shale and make it flow in prodigious quantities has profoundly changed both the world economy and a lot of geopolitical events in the world. And I'll just try and flesh a few of those examples out. So if we talk firstly about the economic impacts, clearly and obviously the price of oil has fallen. It's fallen for no other reason than they can produce oil from that rock for $40 a barrel. It is extraordinary that for $40 a barrel, they can do everything. It's very hard to explain to you what everything is. It's an extraordinary amount of work to make that rock flow like a tap. Unbelievable. It's profoundly changed global oil supplies, but also global gas supplies. And in the history of shale, it's right, so they actually figured out how to get gas out of it before they figured out how to get oil out of it. So the US is incredibly long gas. It's got vast gas reserves. Those gas reserves and those oil prices have profoundly changed the cost of oil and gas globally. And what that's done is several things. Firstly, of course, in the US, it's created a far more competitive and robust economy. And in a global context, thank God, at least the US is growing a little bit. Because absent any growth in the US, it would be very difficult to see any growth anywhere in the world. So it's a bit troubling to say that the US economy is the shining light in global economies, but at least it's recovering and it's growing at least a little bit. In no substantial part because they now have the cheapest energy in the world. 10 years ago, you would not have said, you might have thought it would be in the Middle East, you would not have said that the US will be the centre of global petrochemical industry, plastics manufacturing, and all things that come from hydrocarbons, all things that come from methane, ethane, propane, butane, are all happening in US refineries. So the revitalisation of US manufacturing and US jobs based on this staggering transformation is extraordinary. What's that economic transformation done globally? It has changed the relative competitiveness of nations. So the German economy and the European economy is uncompetitive versus the US economy largely because of that massive transformation in terms of the competitiveness of US manufacturing. I'll draw out a little bit later as to why, but what that's done is profoundly impacted policies around renewables and other things, because the problem the European economy now has got is it's embedded a lot of renewables in its energy mix, which are incredibly expensive, at the same time that its competitor hasn't, and its competitors' costs are therefore falling, and seeing a massive transfer of wealth and jobs. The second area of impact you could reflect on is the massive transfer of wealth from oil-producing nations to oil-consuming nations. And what you see ultimately is a significant increase or decrease in the economic well-being of those producing nations, and a significant increase in consuming nations like the US. But those producing nations, and most recently I was reflecting on an article in respect to Venezuela, and I don't really read about Venezuela every day, but the food queues are lengthened in Venezuela. You get 2 coupons a week for food rations. That economy cannot feed itself because there is a huge budget deficit. It was entirely an economy, as are many oil-producing economies, dependent on oil price. Too many years of $100 oil, those economies are bankrupt, and very soon social disorder must follow. There are many, when we turn to the geopolitics, that believe, and I have to say that there's much conspiracy theory in the energy industry, so you can choose whether you want to believe this or not. But of course the US is very comfortable with world oil price where it is because it contains Russian ambition. Oil is profoundly important to the Russian economy. Resources is profoundly important to the Russian economy. With oil and gas prices where they are, remembering Russia is the major provider of energy to Western Europe, it hugely changes the capacity of countries like Russia to do mischief through US eyes. The question economically is why, in response to such massive stimulus, so if you think about the fall in oil price as global stimulus, much more sort of fiscal stimulus than any government could bring to bear, why is the world not booming? That's the economic puzzle. Why is the world not booming? And must be in bad shape, because the stimulus of lower energy prices, notwithstanding the transfer of value from producing to consuming nations, is huge. As I say, the fiscal stimulus is bigger than governments could alone provide. And again, it's always difficult to know precisely the answer. But the theory idea that has most favour is that we're on the brink of another collapse in respect to the financial community. And the risk that we're perhaps on the brink of another GFC is because US banks have lent $1.2 trillion to US-based shale companies to drill shale, which has collapsed the oil price and makes it difficult for them to repay the debt. So the simple question, why is the world not booming in response to such a banking system and the exposure the banking system has to those producers? And the rate of bankruptcy in the US gas industry, or oil and gas industry, is rising rapidly as, I'm sorry about the detail, as hedges come off and hedge those first few years of production. There is a significant risk of bankruptcy and default, and therefore a significant amount of risk sitting in the financial system, which must in part explain why the world's not booming, because it should be booming in response to that stimulus that's coming from low oil prices. So there's a number of quite dramatic economic effects that arise from this technological change, this huge change in the way that oil and gas is produced. I should, by the way, when I reference sand, I'm leaving the digital part of the story to someone else when I talk about sand and silicon as being the basis for the digital revolution. But of course, the other thing sand's used for is the manufacture of photovoltaic cells, because silicon is the building block for photovoltaic cells. So when we look at the sort of transformation in our energy economies that people are expecting, solar has a huge role to play. 10 years ago, silicon was produced solely for chip manufacture. It needed to be what was called 9 nines pure. So people talked about silicon that needed to be 99.999999999% pure, 9 nines pure. Incredibly expensive, cost over $400 a kilogram to make silicon that pure. That was what the solar industry used in its early days, leftover silicon from the semiconductor industry. As the solar industry grew, it only needs 5 nines solar, 99.99999% pure. A lot cheaper, $20 a kilogram to produce. The reason photovoltaic cells are getting cheaper and cheaper is twofold: scale, making more. And secondly, the price of silicon is profoundly cheaper than it was because it's much more easily produced for the photovoltaic industry, whose use is crude relative to the use of the semiconductor industry to make silicon. So our energy future is driven by these two things, sand and shale. And these are the two amazing technological transformations that are driving certainly this 20 or 30 year period in terms of how we use energy. If we go to the geopolitical side of things, I've also already made some comments that would evidence to you how these influences play out. The US doesn't care that much more about the Middle East because it's no longer dependent on the Middle East. I think Neil made reference to the Arab Spring a while ago, and there is again a theory, and I'll caution again that our industry is full of speculation as to the nature of the geopolitical events, but many would say the Arab Spring has occurred for no other reason than the US was much more sanguine about Shia-driven or Saudi-driven intervention in these countries, the Muslim Brotherhood, which led to a lot of these uprisings which were branded the Arab Spring, but which were really revolutions because the US is just much more sanguine about it. It just doesn't care that much about the Middle East now, relative to 5 to 10 years ago, where clearly the Middle East was the world's swing oil producer. Clearly the US is the world's swing oil producer now, because there's nothing the Middle East can do to change the path of oil prices, because it's so easy to bring that shale that's going around the world into production at incredible rates of vast reserves. There is, and if you do like, and I'll continue down this path of conspiracy theory just because they're interesting, but they may not be right, Syrian and European events are explained entirely in the context of energy. You might say, that how does that play out? And the view there is that Syria is actually a proxy war. And Syria is a proxy war between Shia and Sunni ambition to supply gas from either Iran, Iraq to Western Europe, or from Qatar and Saudi Arabia to Western Europe. How do you get gas from those areas to Western Europe? Through Syria. It's the only way you can go. Russian ambition sees that gas competing with Russian gas to Western Europe. Western Europe wants to diversify its gas supplies. With Syria, it's just a proxy war between Sunni and Shia competition for supply of gas to Western Europe, overlaid with Russian interests, protecting their economic interests as well. That war, of course, is devastating in Syria, but many would say it has significant implications in Europe, and you talk about some of the refugee issues. Many would say, and I think it's true to say, that Germany, which built its economy as much as anything on cheap labour, cheap Turkish labour, is now losing that cheap Turkish labour because Turkish GDP is going up. Look for a substitute form of labour. Refugees look good. Germany actually was the first country in Europe to drop its borders. And of course, Syrian refugees have poured across those borders and created massive instability in Europe. So you can see how these events can pile up on each other. Nothing is to say that's true, and it explains the world in its entirety. But energy is, in many ways, central to everything, to national aspirations. Does the US care? No, because the US is long gas and expects to export LNG to Western Europe. Western Europe will receive LNG instead of Russian gas. It will diversify its energy sources from the Middle East and Russia. So the US has a very different interest in these matters than it would have had 5 or 10 years ago. So hopefully so far you can understand why I would say, from my view of the world, energy explains everything. That explains a lot about what's happening in the world, certainly in a political and an economic context. But it also sets up some way of thinking about the future. And I think the key to that future arguably comes out of the COP21 negotiation in Paris last year. And if you're into those acronyms, you know COP21 was the most recent round of negotiations on climate change in Paris, where contrary to Copenhagen, where it was complete failure, Paris did produce essentially a global agreement on response to climate change. And you'll know that in the context of that global agreement, in very broad terms, the world's nations have signed up to limit global warming to around 2 degrees C. And in order to do that, it does require some significant and profound change as to how we use energy. Now to go back, as I said, I'll recover, if I go back to two, and I want to use the US and Germany as two different ways, or analogues if you like, for explaining how the world is setting out to solve this problem. Let's use Germany and US as those two examples. I found for the recent federal election campaign quite frustrating the way our good friends in the Green community constantly refer to the shining light that Germany's given about renewables. Germany is, and you may well have this view as well, that Germany's led the way in the introduction of renewable energy, piloted hugely the development of solar energy, wind, for example, in Germany. As an aside, by the way, there's been a massive misallocation of capital because I assume many of you are well travelled in Europe, and you'll know that the sun shines in Spain and the wind blows in Northern Europe. Would that be a fair analogy? Where have they put all the solar energy? In Northern Europe. Where have they put all the wind? In Spain. Completely massive misallocation of capital, hundreds of billions of dollars of misallocation of capital, because policies that have been implemented prior to and in response to climate change have been at best poorly guided and often very poorly implemented and have destroyed massive amounts of value. So if I go to this German example and this US example, contrary to what many would believe and many would hope would be the case. The US, which never signed the Kyoto Agreement and is generally, amongst many in the environmental community, considered a laggard on these issues, has reduced its carbon emissions at 3 times the rate that Germany has. 3 times the rate. And it's done so by the massive substitution of gas that has come from shale for coal. So that economic benefit, that cheap gas, has simply economically displaced coal. That's why companies like Peabody are now in Chapter 11. So that explains what's happening to the coal industry. 5 years ago, Michael may well have advised you to invest in coal companies, maybe 6 or 7. Would you invest in the coal company today? Most unlikely. Coal, if you like, the economics of coal have completely changed, but in substantial part because US gas has pushed US coal out. US coal is hitting the export market, particularly in Western Europe, and that's trashing the coal price globally. And it's hard to see that dynamic changing, frankly. So the relative value of fuels is impacted by these changes. But the substitution of gas for coal has dramatically reduced US greenhouse gas emissions in the last 5 years by more than, so the reduction in the US in the last 5 years is more than all of Australia's carbon emissions. So in 5 years, the US has reduced by an amount greater than all of Australia's carbon emissions, simply by the substitution of gas for coal. And what the US has done is said, in respect of its Paris commitment, we'll just keep that going. And so their commitment, which sounds pretty good, is in fact just business as usual, the continued substitution of gas for coal. Australia's commitment, which is about the same, 26 to 28% reduction by 2030, about the same, is hugely ambitious and require a 50% per capita reduction in the amount of carbon emissions from how we use all things to do with things that create carbon, but broadly energy in Australia. So our commitment as a nation is vastly, relatively bigger than the US. In Germany, despite the massive investment in renewables, the outcome in Germany is the OECD's highest electricity cost. They have the highest electricity cost in the OECD. 35 OECD countries, the US has the 3rd lowest electricity cost. Australia, by the way, has the 13th lowest electricity cost. So when I say affordability, we're actually pretty okay in Australia for energy cost. So the Germans have achieved the highest electricity cost, which is why I said their economy is becoming uncompetitive on an energy basis versus the US. They have very little reduction in their total carbon emissions, and the other key part of the puzzle is why? Because they put huge amounts of renewable in, because they're also shutting their nuclear fleet. And what people have forgotten is that nuclear are carbon zero or zero emission plants. You take them out, you put renewables in, but you get no gain in the economy. You just drive your cost up. And what's happening in order to drive down average cost, the Germans are building coal, heaven forbid, so their emissions aren't falling. The US substituted gas for coal, emissions are falling, 3rd cheapest electricity price in the world, very competitive economy. Vastly different outcomes depending upon the path they take. So just to finish up, because I'm sure that Michael would like to spend a long time speaking as well, I just want to then bring this back to Australia and perhaps make it relevant or more relevant to what we are and should be doing in Australia. We did take to Paris, and like I said, let's just talk about Paris and what that means. Australia has taken to Paris a 26 to 28% reduction by 2030 on carbon emissions. That would broadly be 800 or 900 million tonnes reduction over that 10-year period. That is actually a huge target. For those of you who hear, well, Australia hasn't muscled up and really made a commitment, it is one of the biggest relative commitments in the world for reduction of carbon, and of course, carbon emissions. And of course, in the election, the Labor Party, for example, was saying, we'll double that. We'll go for 45% reduction. That would come at a huge cost to the Australian economy in this short-term period. And I gave you 2 examples of different pathways, the German and American pathway. We have to be very careful about the path we take. There is no question we will use more renewable energy in Australia, but South Australia is a very real exemplar of how, if that is unthoughtfully implemented, it actually creates huge problems. And the reason it creates huge problems is that renewables, of course, are intermittent. The wind does not blow all the time and the sun does not shine at night. So renewables provide energy, but it does not provide capacity. And if you go back to that hierarchy of reliability, affordability and sustainability, renewable starts at the bottom and ticks the sustainability box in many people's eyes, but it is not reliable and it will cost a lot more. So in broad terms, excuse me, the cost of energy in Australia, electricity, which you can think of it in average terms is $50. Would cost about $80 or $90 as we increasingly move to renewables. And the Australian community is remarkably intolerant to increased costs. We had an election, not this one, the last one, arguably fought over carbon prices of $10 a tonne. and the renewable energy targeting bodies a carbon cost of $40 or $50 a tonne. So there is much about the detail that makes the story more complicated than it seems. But there is no doubt, because there is bipartisan political commitment, that both sides of government, or both sides of politics in Australia, are committed to significant reductions in carbon emissions, at least 26 or 28%. And that will require a very, very significant transformation of our energy economy over the next few years. And that will have impacts on companies. If I sort of go out more broadly again to a global context, what are you seeing? Well, coal would be a very difficult place to invest, I would imagine now. And we're seeing that, as I say, with, for example, companies like Peabody going to Chapter 11. The interesting thing is that you'd say, well, let's go invest in solar and wind. That's renewable. But what's the other big Chapter 11 in the US? Is Sun Edison, who heavily invested in solar and wind, and they've gone broke as well. So how do you make sense of this? Because everybody's going broke. And the answer is, of course, no one wants to pay the higher price for renewables. And that's the dilemma. No one really wants to pay for it. And we survey our customer base and say, do you like renewable energy? 85% say we love it. And when we survey them and say, how much more would you pay for it? A very large proportion, 90%, say nothing. And that's the problem. So, you know, you've got Sun Edison going into Chapter 11, you've got Peabody going to Chapter 11, you've got coal going into Chapter 11, you've got renewables going to Chapter 11. It's a very difficult equation to solve. And it needs to be solved by companies that have the financial capacity, the liquidity, if you like, the strategies and the assets to manage that transition on a sensible basis. And arguably, without an advertisement, I'd argue Origin is one of those companies that is well placed to manage that transition over the years ahead. I would think I've spoken to more than my allotted time, so I will cease. And I think maybe there's some time for questions and answers a little bit later on. So thank you very much for your attention. If you're willing to interview, I apologise.